Now, they call it the Doomsday Clock, and it symbolizes just how close humanity is to self-annihilation. Well, the closer the clock gets to midnight, the more danger we're all in. Well, the sad news is that a couple of factors have resulted in that Doomsday Clock advancing by 10 seconds, meaning we're now just 90 seconds to midnight. That is the closest the clock has ever been to midnight. Midnight, of course, symbolizing the end. Well, let's find out more now from Suzet McKinney, who's a member of the Science and Security Board at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. That's the bulletin which the Doomsday Clock is set by each year. Now, Suzette, thank you so much for joining us. You were one of the speakers on today's panel, which this rather bleak announcement was made. Just tell us, how was this decision reached to put the clock forward by 10 seconds?
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for having me. What I can tell you is that the Science and Security Board at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, we spend a considerable amount of time debating and deliberating over the threats and the challenges that we are seeing across our global community. And so when we were setting the time on the Doomsday Clock, as always, we considered the threat of nuclear war. We consider emerging technologies such as biological threats, and we also consider climate change, all as factors that go into the setting of the Doomsday Clock. But in addition to those three factors, one of the things that also contributed to the clock moving closer to midnight was the Russian war on the Ukraine. And so it was a combination of things that caused us to move the clock the closest to midnight that it has ever been.
Yeah, I mean, can you see that the hands of that clock moving away from midnight in the years ahead, or do you think climate change is so significant a factor that it basically can't go backwards until climate change is effectively dealt with?
Well, you know, if you were able to view the clock statement this morning, earlier today, one of the things that each of the members of the Science and Security Board talked about near the end of that broadcast was some bright spots that we see in the months and years ahead. And so to answer your question, I do think that I can see the hands of the clock moving back away from midnight. However, there is a lot of work that needs to be done in order for that to happen. You know, a cooperation among the global community in terms of how we address these various threats. You know, we can always make progress with climate change. It's not too late to begin that now. So those are some bright spots, but also just that cooperation among global countries and communities to begin to do more work to address biological threats and hazards, particularly around infectious disease outbreaks and pandemics such as the COVID-19 pandemic.
Suzette, for people who aren't aware of the Doomsday Clock or don't know much about it, just tell us a little bit about who created it in the first place and what purpose it served over the years.
Sure. Well, the Doomsday Clock was created in 1947 at the University of Chicago by a number of researchers. And essentially, the clock itself is used as a metaphor that describes how dire the situation are with regards to those types of threats that we measure and we study and evaluate and deliberate upon each and every year when we set the time on the Doomsday Clock. So in our setting of the clock today to 90 seconds to midnight, it does not mean that humanity is going to cease to exist. However, what it does mean is that the number of threats that we are concerned about, existential threats, if you will, are greater and more frequent in their occurrence, some of them, such as biological threats like pandemics, but also that the situation is much more dire today than it has been in years prior. And so that's essentially what is meant by the Doomsday Clock. And of course, the other purpose of the clock is to educate and inform the public as to what these issues are and hopefully encourage them to have discussions about these issues within their communities, with their policy developers, as well as their leaders, so that as individual communities and societies, we can begin to address these issues.
Okay, so we're currently the closest we've ever been to midnight. Do you know, I mean, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, do you know what the furthest is we've ever been from midnight since the clock was invented in the 40s?
I do. I believe it was about 1990. The clock was set at the furthest away from midnight that it has ever been, and that setting was at 17 minutes to midnight. So we have progressed quite a long way in the last several years.
So
But we are
considerable
hopeful.
damage, considerable danger. Well, the danger has escalated markedly these last 30 years, basically.
Absolutely, it has.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Suzet McKinney, member of the
Thank you.
Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.